The sun was just setting behind the pine trees that line the lake when I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside my cabin. I had just finished unloading supplies for my truck and was about to sit on the porch when the sharp voice of Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, broke the evening calm. She stormed up the path, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed like she was ready for battle. "You cannot just park here," she snapped, her tone high and shrill. "This is HOA property, and your cabin is not even supposed to be here. I am calling the police right now." I sighed because I knew Karen well. She had been a thorn in my side from the day I moved into the lake community, always demanding dues, always insisting on rules that had nothing to do with my land. "Go ahead," I said calmly, leaning back against the railing. I had nothing to fear. Karen pulled out her phone with exaggerated movements like she wanted the whole world to know she was in charge. She dialed the local police, and within minutes a patrol car pulled into the driveway, red and blue lights flashing against the trees. The officers stepped out, and Karen rushed to them like she had been waiting for her moment to shine. "This man is trespassing on HOA property," she declared loudly. "He refuses to follow the rules, and he thinks he can just do whatever he wants." The deputies turned to me, waiting for my response. I could see the hint of a smile on their faces, like they already suspected there was more to the story. I reached into the folder I had left on the porch and pulled out the official property deed. The paper crackled as I unfolded it, holding it up for everyone to see. "Actually, officers," I said with a steady voice, "not only do I own this cabin, I also own the parcel that includes the very home Karen is living in right now." The silence that followed was heavy. Karen froze in place, her phone slipping in her hand, her mouth opened, but no words came out, her face drained of color as the officers turned their attention back to her. "Ma'am," one deputy said carefully, "are you aware that he owns your property as well?" Karen stammered, shaking her head as if denying the truth would change it. No, that is not possible. This is my home. This is HOA property. I am in charge here." But the deed was clear. The lines and signatures left no room for argument. I had purchased a large portion of land months before Karen ever knew, and her home sat right on it. The officers exchanged a look, clearly done with her theatrics. They told Karen to calm down and warned her about making false claims. Karen backed away slowly, eyes wide, her grip tightening on the clipboard she always carried like a shield. Her power had vanished in an instant, replaced by the raw realization that she was standing on land she did not even truly own. I stood quietly, letting the truth settle around her. The neighbors had come out onto their porches, curious about the flashing lights and the commotion. They whispered to each other, pointing at Karen, who now looked smaller than ever. Karen glanced at them, at the officers, at me. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "What do you mean you own my place?" The evening air felt still heavy with tension as everyone waited to see what would happen next. I held the paper steady in my hands as Karen stared at it like it was written in another language. The deputies stepped closer, and one of them asked me to show the boundary lines. I unfolded the map attached to the deed, pointing out the shaded areas, the cabin, the land, and yes, even the parcel where Karen's house stood. Karen's knees wobbled, and she clutched her clipboard tighter as if holding onto it would keep her authority intact. "That cannot be true," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My husband and I bought that house years ago. It is ours. It has always been ours." I kept my tone calm, steady, and unshaken. "I am not saying you do not own your house, Karen. What I am saying is that the ground your house sits on is mine. You pay taxes for your building, but the land was purchased by me months ago from the original developer." The crowd of neighbors gasped. Some even stepped forward, wanting to catch a glimpse of the deed themselves. The deputy cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am, property laws are very clear. If the land was sold to him, then you are subject to his ownership for use of the ground beneath your structure. You might want to confirm this at the courthouse." Karen's face turned pale. Her eyes darted from me to the neighbors and back again, as if hoping someone would leap in to save her pride. But no one did. They all stood watching, waiting. I tucked the papers back into my folder and leaned against the porch railing again. My voice was calm but firm. "You see, Karen, this whole time you thought you were above everyone else. You threatened me, you called the police, and yet you forgot one important thing. Not everything is under HOA control." Karen opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She stuttered as the weight of the truth pressed down on her shoulders. The deputies finally gave a nod in my direction, then turned to her. "Ma'am, unless you can prove otherwise, we suggest you stop making these calls unnecessarily. They carry consequences." The neighbors began murmuring louder now, some even chuckled, quietly shaking their heads at the woman who had spent years lording over them. Karen looked around at the eyes that once obeyed her authority, now filled with disbelief and even amusement. She lowered her clipboard slowly, her hands shaking, her breath shallow. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees filled the silence, as Karen's world seemed to crumble right in front of her. Karen's lips quivered as if she wanted to shout, but no sound came out. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, clearly ready to leave, but also unwilling to turn their backs on the strange tension filling the air. One neighbor stepped forward, a man named Tom who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. He shook his head and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Karen, you have been making people miserable for years. You nitpicked about lawns, fences, kids playing too loud. You acted like a queen over land that was never yours." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some even nodded their heads with folded arms, standing united against the woman who had always demanded obedience. Karen snapped her head toward Tom, her face red with humiliation. "That is not true. I only wanted order. I only wanted respect." But Tom raised a hand, cutting her off. "Respect is earned, Karen, not forced, and today you lost it." Her shoulders slumped at his words. The clipboard slipped from her grip and hit the porch with a hollow thud echoing through the still air. I watched quietly, letting the truth sink in around me. The neighbors seemed to draw closer, not to her, but to each other, almost as if her collapse of authority was giving them permission to breathe freely for the first time in years. Karen's voice broke in a whisper, barely audible over the wind. "What happens now?" I stepped forward, slowly meeting her eyes with calm certainty. "Now, Karen, you live like the rest of us, not above us, not against us. And if you want to stay on this land, you will learn to cooperate, because the rules you tried to impose were never yours to enforce in the first place." Her face tightened with a mix of fear and realization. Her kingdom of control had fallen, and all she could do was stand in the ruins of it while everyone else finally saw her for who she was. The silence stretched heavy over the porch until a child's laugh rang out from the yard beyond, reminding everyone that life in the neighborhood had just shifted forever. Karen's eyes darted from one neighbor to another as though searching for someone to defend her, but no one stepped forward. Her once loyal supporters now looked away, avoiding her gaze, their silence louder than any argument. For the first time, she seemed small and uncertain, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I turned to the deputies who had been standing patiently watching the scene unfold. They nodded toward me, one of them saying calmly, "It looks like this matter is settled. You have the right papers, and that is what counts." The deputies walked back to their car, leaving Karen standing in the shadow of her own undoing. The neighbors slowly dispersed, whispering to one another, their voices carrying relief and even a hint of joy at the change that was unfolding. Tom lingered by the edge of the porch, shaking his head as he looked at Karen. "You could have had friends here, Karen. Instead, you chose enemies." Her jaw tightened, but no reply came. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the ground as though the weight of her own decisions was too much to face. I picked up the clipboard she had dropped and handed it back to her, not out of kindness, but to remind her that her time of false authority was over. She clutched it against her chest like a shield, but the paper held no power anymore. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of children playing freely, as if the entire neighborhood had already begun to heal from years of her control. Karen stood still, frozen in place, while the rest of us walked forward into a future she no longer ruled. Karen remained on the porch, her face pale, as though the world around her was slipping from her grasp. The laughter of the children echoed louder, now filling the neighborhood with a life she had tried so hard to suppress. Neighbors who had once avoided gatherings now spoke freely to one another, without glancing in her direction for permission. Tom walked closer to me, his voice steady. "But lo, you have done what none of us dared to do. You showed her she was never the authority she claimed to be." I nodded, but my eyes stayed fixed on Karen. She was still standing there, clutching her clipboard tighter, as though she believed she could will her false power back into existence. The more she clung to it, the more obvious it became that she was only holding on to an empty symbol. A woman from down the street called out toward me, her tone filled with gratitude. "We are finally free of her. We owe you more than you know." Her words spread through the crowd like fire, and soon others joined in, voices rising with relief and agreement. Karen flinched at every cheer, each sound breaking through her pride and leaving her exposed. The air grew lighter, the heavy tension that had ruled the neighborhood fading with every passing moment. And as I stood there, I realized this was not just about proving my ownership, it was about reclaiming the peace and dignity that Karen had stolen from everyone for so long. Karen finally lowered her clipboard, and her lips trembled as though she wanted to argue, but the words would not come. The sheriff shifted his weight and said firmly, "This neighborhood will not be run by intimidation anymore. Property rights are clear, and there is nothing more to discuss." The crowd seemed to breathe in unison, relief washing over them like a long-awaited rain after drought. Karen turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the neighbors who once feared her. She saw them now standing tall, refusing to bow to her authority. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked small, her commanding presence reduced to silence. I felt the shift in the air. It was no longer Karen who held the power, but the truth and the unity of the people around me. One by one, neighbors stepped closer, their voices rising in support. Some spoke of fines she had imposed, others of rules she had invented to control them. Each story was another crack in the wall of control Karen had built, and the wall was falling fast. The sheriff listened quietly, his face stern, but his eyes showed he understood exactly what had been happening here for years. Karen clenched her fists, but she had no defense left. The silence from her lips was louder than any denial she could have made. I stood firm, watching as the authority she once wielded crumbled right there on her own porch. The sheriff finally raised his hand to calm the growing voices around us, and the group fell quiet, though the energy of resistance still burned in their eyes. Karen shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the sheriff and the neighbors, her usual sharp tone nowhere to be found. The sheriff looked directly at her and said, "Karen, this is not about you anymore. This is about the law and the rights of the people who live here." The words hung heavy in the air, and for once Karen did not interrupt. She simply swallowed hard, her face paling even more. One of the older neighbors stepped forward, his voice cracked with emotion as he said, "We have lived under her threats for too long. We are tired of being bullied." Others nodded their heads, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen looked around, her eyes darting desperately as if searching for someone to defend her, but no one moved in her favor. The sheriff turned to me and said, "You have the right papers, and the deed is valid. That settles this." I nodded quietly, though inside I felt a rush of vindication, not for myself alone but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's false authority. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands shook slightly as she clutched the clipboard closer to her chest. The crowd no longer feared her. They stood taller now, voices rising again with determination. It was clear Karen's reign of control was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to hold on to it. Karen opened her mouth as if to argue, but no sound came out. Her voice, the very weapon she had always relied on, had abandoned her. The neighbors began speaking louder, no longer whispering behind closed doors, but now openly sharing stories of fines, threats, and false accusations they had endured under her. One woman lifted her child into her arms and said, "Karen tried to fine me because my daughter left chalk drawings on the sidewalk. She made us feel like criminals for being a family." Another man stepped forward, saying, "She told me I could not have flowers in my front yard because it clashed with her vision of the neighborhood. She made me tear them out." The sheriff listened carefully, his arms crossed, his expression firm as he heard each story. Karen's face grew red with every word. She shook her head, muttering under her breath, trying to deny it, but no one cared to listen to her excuses anymore. I stepped closer and looked her in the eyes. "Karen, this has gone far enough. This neighborhood does not belong to you. You do not control us." Her jaw tightened, but she had no comeback. Her power was gone, replaced by the weight of truth pressing down from all sides. The neighbors who once walked quickly past her house now stood side by side, united, stronger than they had ever been. For the first time, Karen realized she was outnumbered and outmatched, not just by me, not just by the sheriff, but by the very people she had tried to rule over. Karen's eyes darted from face to face, as if searching for just one person who might still support her, but every pair of eyes glared back with the same cold judgment. She tried to laugh it off, her voice shaky. She said, "You people are exaggerating. I only wanted to keep the neighborhood beautiful. I was just following the rules." But the sheriff raised his hand, silencing her. "Rules are meant to serve the people, Karen, not to be used as weapons to control them." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, stronger, now louder, as if the whole neighborhood had finally found its voice. One elderly man stepped forward, his cane tapping the ground as he spoke. "Karen, I have lived here longer than anyone, and you made me feel like a stranger in my own home. That ends today." Karen flinched at his words, her confidence crumbling like a wall struck at its foundation. I folded my arms and looked at her calmly. "Karen, this was never about rules, it was always about control, and now everyone sees it." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been, and Karen stood frozen, her hands trembling as the weight of her own actions closed in around her. Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. The crowd no longer saw her as the authority she once pretended to be, but as someone exposed and powerless. The sheriff stepped closer, her voice firm and final. "Karen, you no longer have any say here. Your behavior has gone too far. This community deserves peace and respect, not fear and intimidation." A cheer rose from the neighbors, a cheer of relief and unity, voices blending together in a way they never had before. Karen lowered her head, her pride broken. She turned slowly and walked away, her steps heavy, as if the ground itself resisted her leaving. I looked around at my neighbors, and for the first time in a long while I saw smiles instead of suspicion. People who once whispered behind closed doors now stood shoulder to shoulder, free from the shadow Karen had cast. That night the neighborhood felt lighter, the air clearer, as if the weight had finally lifted. And though Karen's name would still be remembered, it would never again hold power, only as a reminder of what happens when control meets truth. The community had found its voice, and it would never be silenced again.